Hi, I'm Brandy, and in this video we're going to be doing a trunk chest coffee table makeover, or at least that's what I'm calling it. My mother-in-law wanted a coffee table for her living room, and we found this piece at a place called Treasure Hunters right down the street, and I immediately seen the potential for something that she was looking for that would be kind of dual purpose, where it could be a coffee table and also act as a storage. As you can see inside here, a lot of capacity to put blankets or whatever kind of storage that you want inside. So I was super excited to get to work on this one. She had an idea in mind already of the colors that she wanted. She was kind of going for that farmhouse theme, white on the bottom, brown on the top. So evaluating this piece, there wasn't any significant damage. The legs were a little bit turned. They weren't straight, and then there was some scuff here on the bottom that you can see on those legs. Also on the top, there was a little bit of damage on the corner, as you can see here, a little bit of like scrapes and scratches, but nothing too significant. So I thought that this would be a perfect piece for what she was looking for to add as an addition to her home. And so I was excited to get to work on this. So the first order of business was to thoroughly clean this thing. I used some Dawn dish soap and water to give the entire chest a thorough scrub down. It's always super important to scrub the furniture before you do anything with it. You don't want to start sanding or apply any paint or primer to furniture before you give it a thorough cleaning. And the reason for that is because if you start painting over something that's kind of dirty, then all of that dirt is going to get stuck underneath the paint, and then the longevity of your paint is not going to be successful. So you're going to start seeing it crack and do all kinds of weird stuff. And if you start sanding right on top of that dirtiness as well, you're going to burn through sandpaper. So always thoroughly clean it. And then I'll go back through with a wet rag just to kind of rinse everything off. Sometimes this takes a couple go-overs of going through with that wet rag, but just making sure to get off all of the soap as well as all of the dirt that's in those little creases and crevices. The next thing I did was come in with some all-purpose Bondo putty, and I had a plastic spoon on hand, so I just started globbing it onto a piece of cardboard. And I love Bondo. It works wonders. I mean, this stuff is amazing. I use it in lieu of any wood filler. So it's a Bondo all-purpose putty, and then you add in the cream hardener that comes along with that putty. And once you add the cream hardener, you start mixing it together, and it starts activating the drying process. And it dries rather quickly, so you got to work pretty quick. I used a spatula to just start applying it to the areas where there was some damage. So right here on the corner where it was kind of, I don't know, chewed up or whatever you want to call it, and just started kind of forming it into place. And then I took any extra that I had and started going around the table and finding out any other places where I can see that there were some rather deep scuffs or chips that would even it out in the long run. Now the Bondo, like I said, it dries quick, so you only need about 15-20 minutes or so, and then it's ready to get to sanding. So I came in with some 150 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander, and I just started going over the entire top just to make sure that everything was going to be even. And obviously in those spots where I had added the Bondo, they needed a little bit more attention than the rest of the top. So going over the entire surface and making sure to sand it down to an even level surface. I wasn't too worried about going all the way down to the wood grain because we weren't staining this thing. We were going to paint it. So if I was going to stain it, I probably would have used the Bondo wood filler that could adapt to a stain. In this case, we were painting. So the regular standard Bondo was going to be perfectly fine for what I was doing. I didn't need to worry about how the color was going to match to the wood grain. And I also didn't need to worry about the direction in which I was sanding, although I tried to keep it consistent. But once I went over the entire top with the 150, I then circled back with the 220, and that just kind of gave it a smoother finish before I started applying the product. Now the top is where most of the damage was, but I still needed to come into the rest of the body of the table to give it a scuff sand with that 220 grit sandpaper. And this gives something for the paint to adhere to. So I used the sander where I could. I came in with a sanding sponge and wrapped around a 220 grit sandpaper around that just to get into all those little creases, just to make sure that I got into all the little sections where the sander was not able to make it into, so that that scuff sanding would be there so that the paint had something to adhere to once I was getting ready to apply that paint. After I sanded everything, I went ahead and cleaned it all off and I brought it inside. Once I brought it inside, I was ready to start taping off the hinges so that no paint would get onto the actual hinges in the back. There were 3 of them. So I just used some painter's tape to kind of cover those up. You'll notice later on in the video, I changed the method, but for the purposes of applying the primer, I went ahead and covered up those hinges so that no paint would get on there and make it all difficult to open and close and whatnot. Then I came out with the primer. So I used the Behr primer with shellac. Super important to have that shellac base because it acts as a barrier between any bleed through that would possibly take place. And then I just brushed this over the entire piece using just a whatever brush. This primer has a lot of odor, so you definitely want to make sure to do it in a well ventilated area. There was a lot of wind going on outside, so that's why I brought it inside to prime. Otherwise I would have primed it out there. But I did have a few doors open and windows, and there was nobody else in the house except for me, so I went ahead and started applying this indoor. Just brushing it on everywhere, and then, you know, on the top here you can see there's creases to where all of those little panels are going, so I went over all of the creases to get into the holes or the creased area with the brush, and then I circled back with my roller to roll it on smooth along the entire surface. Normally when I'm going to a darker color, you don't necessarily need a primer, especially when you're using chalk paint, but because I was going with a two-tone and the base of the table was going to be white, I definitely was going to need the primer down there. So I figured, hey, why not go ahead and apply the primer on the top as well, even though I was doing a darker color up there. It just gives it more of a consistent and even starting point, kind of a blank palette to begin with. And I did the same process along all of the base of the table as well, using the brush in all of the little areas where there were creases and crevices, and then going back over with the roller wherever it allowed me to, wherever it would fit basically. After that primer had dried, I came back in with some 220 grit sandpaper and just went through to kind of smooth things out. I went over the entire surface with the sandpaper wrapped around my sanding sponge just to make sure that everything was nice and even and smooth before moving on to coat number 2. And then after sanding down, as you can see, I wiped it down with a lint-free cloth. This is an important step because if you just apply coat after coat after coat, all those little imperfections from any coat are going to seep through to the next coat up. So doing that little buff sanding in between really helps to smooth things out. Now for some projects, 1 coat of primer may be sufficient. And on other projects, you may need 2 coats of primer. In this case, I did. So I went ahead and applied the second coat of primer. Now, when you're going to a lighter color that I was doing on the base of the table, and you're going down to like a white, you want to make sure that you're not going to get a bleed through later on. So applying a second coat of primer, even though it takes extra time, it really eases the coats of paints that you're going to be applying later without having the risk of the bleed through. So just to be safe rather than sorry, on this particular project, going with the white on the base, I went ahead and went with 2 coats of primer for this entire piece. After the second coat had dried, you'll notice here we had a way more consistent color, a very blank slate of white for us to get to work on. So I still followed the same process. I came back in with my 220 grit sanding paper and scuff sanded this entire thing just to make sure that the surface was nice and even and smooth. Once I sanded everything, circled back and wiped all the dust off with my lint-free cloth. Now I was ready to apply the paint. For this project, I'm using the Behr chalk paint in the color Pinecone Path, which is kind of a truffle color, deep chocolate. And so I just cracked this sucker open and then started giving it a really good stir. I always make sure to stir the paint for about a minute or 2, and then I pour it into the container that I'm going to be using. That thorough stirring is super important to make sure that you're going to get that consistent layer of paint. Now, for application purposes, I picked up a chalk paint brush from Walmart. This was the first time that I was using this brush. And I was at Walmart, I seen it, I said, hey, why not give it a try? Hated it so much. I'll never use it again, I'll be honest. Pieces of the brush hair was falling everywhere. Now I did take time before the paint application while I was waiting for the primer to dry, and I sat down and I worked with the paintbrush and I started pulling out any loose hairs and spent a significant amount of time doing that and felt like I was going to be good to start working on the project. But as you can see, when I'm applying the paint, I have to go in there and with my finger pick up all of these pieces of hair that were being left behind in the paint that were falling off of the brush. So I was so frustrated at this point. that I ultimately walked over and just dunked this sucker into the trash can. I couldn't take any more of it. All of those little hairs all over the paint is just they're gonna stick in there, and they're gonna stick to that paint, and you're gonna see those hairs in your final product. So you wanna make sure that whenever you're about to apply paint and you're using a brush, that you're taking the time to work with your brush and make sure that there are no loose hairs. And I did so with this brush, but it just failed me all around. So I threw it in the trash, and then I came back shortly after with my Behr chalk paint brush that I use consistently, that I am familiar with and I have confidence in, and that's what helped me get the process done at the end. So here I am with the Behr chalk paint brush going over everything that the Walmart brush failed to do. And so I brushed on the entire top. I didn't use a roller. I know I used a roller when I was applying the primer, and I considered doing that here as well, but I wanted the brush strokes to be there, even though they were going to be very light. You know, with chalk paint, you don't get a whole lot of brush strokes, but you can still kind of see them. But I felt like it gave a unique look to the top of this thing that I wanted to have for my mother-in-law, because she loved the way that my coffee table looked, and I wanted to do the same process for her table as I did for mine, so that she would have that consistent look. So now that I'm using the Behr chalk paint brush, I was getting way better results, and I was finally being pleased with the way that this was turning out. So there goes my rant. Anyways, you'll notice that I put some black tarp in between the top and bottom of the table. I just wanted to add that extra layer of protection, just to make sure that I wasn't getting the brown down on the areas where the white should be. So that wasn't captured in the video, but you'll notice here as I get a closer up on the sides that that black tarp is there. So I'm able to easily and confidently move through applying the paint to the sides without having to worry about it getting on the base of the table. Once this had dried, once the paint had dried, I came back in with some 220 grit sandpaper and just went over the entire surface just to smooth things out, preparing it for my second coat of paint. So I went over it with that 220 grit, and then I circled back with a lint-free cloth just to wipe away any residue from the sanding, and then I was able to at that point move on to the coat number 2. While waiting in between coats, I stored my brush along with my paint in a Ziploc bag just to keep everything fresh, so that it eliminates the need for me to have to clean everything in between, and it works out amazingly. So now I'm coming in and just applying paint coat number 2 onto the surface of the top. Same process as I did for coat number 1, just applying everything in an even, smooth coat. So I did a total of 3 coats on the top here. I followed the same process where I applied a coat, I let it dry, I went back in with some 220 grit sandpaper, wiped it clean, and then reapplied another coat. I did this for a total of 3 coats. I'm only showing 2 on this video just to save some time, but I did 3 total coats on the top of this table of the dark color. So after all 3 coats of the top had dried, I came in to evaluate the situation and realized that I was not going to be able to efficiently apply the base white coat to the bottom of the table without removing the top. So I brought in some resources. My husband and my stepdaughter came in, and we unscrewed the top and we pushed it aside so that I was going to have an easier way to apply the paint to the bottom. Now for the bottom, I'm using the Behr chalk paint in the color Farmhouse White. So this is one of their ideal colors for the chalk paint that they list in their pamphlet. And I'm using the Behr chalk paint brush to apply the Farmhouse White on all of the base of the table. I did not use a roller for this. Again, after the primer, I just stopped using the roller and just went with the paintbrush for the entire piece and just started brushing it on and applying that paint. And with the primer being there already, it made for an easy application. As you can see here, the white really was just able to lay over that primer and be a nice vibrant color that didn't need too much for it to shine through. Once coat number 1 had dried, I came in with some 220 grit sandpaper and just did a light smoothing through between coats. So very similar process to what I was doing on the top, with the darker color evening things out or smoothing things out before applying coat number 2. So I did the sanding, and then I came back through with a lint-free cloth and wiped everything clean. Then I was ready to start applying paint coat number 2. So 3 coats of paint also went on the base of this, in between each coat, sanding in between, wiping it clean, and then reapplying the next coat. And this is what we were looking at after all 3 coats had been applied. It was a nice, beautiful, consistent color. There was no bleed through. So it was perfect, and we were ready to do the top coat. So for the top coat, we're using the Behr decorative wax clear, the color clear, and I'm just applying this with a wax brush and having a lint-free cloth on hand, because what I'm doing here is I'm applying the wax coat in sections, and then after I apply it, I go back through with the lint-free cloth and I buff it out. Now, the wax clear coat is, in my mind, one of the best. It's easy to apply. You don't have to worry about it globbing on too much because you're wiping it and buffing it smooth. There's some other top coats out there that you can use, and you'll notice that on the top I'm using something significantly different. But for the base of this, which is not going to get a lot of traffic, nobody's going to sit their coffee cup on the side of a table. The wax clear coat really works good at providing that layer of protection, and it also has a small bit of sheen, and that sheen gives it a little bit of shine, but not glossy. It's not going to be glossy. It's still going to have that matte finish in a sense, with just a small bit of sheen. So the wax clear coat is definitely one of my favorites, especially when you're going over a white color. It really gives that perfect look for the finish. And you'll notice that the color gets just slightly deeper, and it gives that deeper color with a bit of sheen. So it's really a perfect complement to the paint when you're using a chalk paint, which is very matte. It's, you know, when you're applying chalk paint, it's very matte, and so that wax that gives it just that small bit of sheen, it works out perfectly. It complements it really, really well. I've used other top coats on chalk paint, and depending on what you're looking for the final finish, that can vary, you know, your preference. But for what I was going for with the white color on the base, I just wanted kind of a almost matte-like, but still with that bit of sheen, and the wax is what was going to do it for me. So that had dried, we reaffixed the top, and this is what we were looking at. So the base of the table was done, and now we were ready to apply a top coat to the top. So I was using Varathane triple thick polyurethane to seal the top of this, which I would consider to be a high traffic area. This is an area where you would see a coffee cup, or, you know, food or plates, or just pieces of toys going across the top of this. So this is considered a high traffic area, and so I'm using the triple thick. For the application, I was using this round sponge brush to apply it, and I've used this sponge brush before, and it normally works perfectly. I will tell you that for this particular project, not so well. It did not work out. You'll notice that on the top, we've got pieces of, I wouldn't say wood grain, but pieces of the paneling that are going one way in the middle, and then on the outside, they're going a different direction. So I attempted to apply the top coat, which is super thick. It's a triple thick, so it's supposed to be one application and then you're done. I'm going in the middle here one way, and then eventually going along the edges, but by the time I got to the edges, they were kind of sort of already drying. So it gave me a grainy finish at the end, especially on that right corner that you can see right now, and you'll notice this in just a minute. So although I do recommend applying top coat with this round brush, and I've done so many of times and it works great, because I have pieces that are going different directions, it did not work for what I was doing here. But I'll show you what I did to solve it if you just stay tuned with me. Also, go ahead and let me know in the comments what you think. what you do. And if you have any suggestions for me, any comments, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you want to participate in seeing my journey with flipping furniture in the future, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you're here and you can be notified about any future videos that would be coming out. But as you can see, I am just trying to apply everything in a consistent direction. And now that I'm going to the side to kind of go the opposite direction, this side worked out, I would say, decently, but not really. I mean, you can even see right there in the color that there are sections the color is blotching. Now this dries clear, but the clear finish is going to have that blotching. And as I get to the other side, because it's already started that drying piece of it, it's even worse. It starts almost clumping. And I'll show you that in just a second once it dries. So I would not recommend using the round brush on a project top like this because it didn't work out so well. But I will show you in a few minutes what I did to fix it. So once that top coat had dried, you'll notice it's a very glossy finish. I came in with some 220 grit sandpaper, wrapped it around my sanding block, and just started to smooth things out. Now, when I was applying it, as I stated a couple seconds before, the edges were the main point of focus of where there would be an issue, because those areas started getting a little bit of overlap from when I was applying the top coat in the center. And so when I went back over them in the direction of which I thought that they should go, they had already started drying, and therefore they started kind of globbing up. So on the edges, I focused a lot more on giving it a kind of a deeper sanding with that 220 grit. Just to smooth things out completely, I went a little bit harder, scrubbed a little bit more. Now in the center section, this was all pretty much smooth. It came out pretty good because that was my area of focus when I was initially applying the top coat. But along the edges, I sanded that a lot more and spent a little bit more time in getting that to a more even area. And I did have to do some touch-ups on the in-between, I would call them slats or whatever, where I knew that there was that opposite direction overlay of that top coat. When I went the opposite way with the sponge, that it kind of overlapped that line and provided an inconsistent coverage there. So I wanted to make sure that I smoothed the sides out as well. This was a big pain in my back. If I had used the regular sponge brush from the beginning, I wouldn't have had this issue. I decided to use the round brush because I had had such success using it before on solid surfaces such as dressers and such, and it worked out amazing for that. But here in this situation, we had pieces of wood going one way and then pieces of wood going the opposite way, and that round brush just wasn't cutting it. So I now know not to do that in the future, and hopefully if you're still watching, you know not to do that if you have pieces that are going in opposite directions, because you will get that overlap if you're trying to brush your top coat, especially the triple thick polyurethane in opposite directions. It will dry really quickly on you. But I came in with some tack cloth just to pick up any pieces or any of the little dust that was left behind after sanding, and then I was ready to reapply the top coat. This time using a regular foam brush, where I had a lot more control about where the application of the product was going. So I was able to kind of get those crisp lines to bring it right up against the edge without going over into where I would be putting the opposite direction top coat application. So here I am kind of smoothing it out, and you'll see that I get right up against the edge, but I don't go over it. And this made for a perfect finish. This is what I should have did from the beginning. And that's why I'm saying, for projects like this, where you have pieces of wood that are going the opposite ways, and where you're expecting to have the finish have various angles of application, you don't want to be using the round brush. You want to be using this hard edge brush or foam brush, so that it's going in the same direction and you're not having that overlay. A lot more control for sure, and the finished product is amazing. I know the back of the can says to use a synthetic brush. I've tried that on products and on furniture in the past, and I have not got as good of an outcome as I get with the foam brush. And I've always used the straight edge foam brush until I did this disaster with the round one, where it was kind of a trial and error. But I will tell you, with the triple thick, you definitely want to use the straight edged foam brush, and you'll get that application exactly as you want it. So after the second top coat had dried, I came into the actual chest of the table and used some Howard feed and wax, and I applied this using a lint-free cloth. I just dropped some in there and started spreading it all around, and the feed and wax really helps to deepen that wood color that's on the inside of the chest, and also it provides a really good smell that just makes it smell very pleasant, and it helps to cover up any odors. Not that there were any odors in this chest, because actually this chest was pretty much odor free, but the feed and wax definitely gives it a very good smell, and as you can see here, it deepens the color, which just gives it that much more character and just kind of adds a little bit of additional value. So once I was done doing this, I went ahead and staged this coffee table trunk chest for pictures. And I took some fabulous pictures of this, and I did not list it for sale because, again, this was a chest that was being made over for my mother-in-law. So I set it aside and I had my husband deliver it to her, and she was super excited to see the final product. And I thank you all for following along with my journey on redoing this table. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear about them down in the comment area. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. And if you want to see any future content from me, please go ahead and subscribe, turn on any notifications. I will have a lot of future projects coming up. I'm always working on a new piece of furniture. So thank you so much for stopping by. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a wonderful week. And I'll throw in a before picture just so you can remember where we got started.